The first gunshot of the evening tore through the calm spring air of Promise Creek as Zeke Maddox ducked behind the saloon's water trough, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was 1876, and the Montana Territory was no place for the faint of heart, especially not when you'd accidentally won a high-stakes poker game against the notoriously ill-tempered Barton brothers. "I told you to fold that hand, Maddox," Zeke's friend Thomas hissed from behind a nearby barrel. "Those Bartons don't take kindly to losing, especially not to a ranch hand who's just passing through." Zeke gripped his Colt revolver tighter, the metal warm against his calloused palm. At 28, he'd spent the last decade drifting from one cattle outfit to another across the Western Territories, never staying in one place long enough for the dust to settle on his boots. That's how he liked it, unattached, unburdened, answering to no one but himself and whatever trail boss was paying his wage for the season. Another shot splintered the wood just inches from his head. "You can't hide forever, cowboy," Floyd Barton's gravelly voice echoed down the muddy street. "Come on out and take what's coming to you like a man." Zeke glanced at Thomas, who shook his head in warning. They both knew Floyd didn't just want the money back, he wanted blood. "Sheriff's out of town till tomorrow," Thomas whispered. "You'd best make yourself scarce till then." Zeke nodded grimly. "My horse is at the livery. Cover me." Thomas pulled his own pistol. "On three. 1, 2. On 3, Thomas fired 2 shots over the trough, and Zeke sprinted toward the alley that would lead him to the livery stable. He heard curses and returned fire behind him, but didn't slow down, his spurs jangling with each desperate stride. 10 minutes later, he was galloping out of Promise Creek with nothing but his saddle bag, rifle, the clothes on his back, and a pouch containing his poker winnings, $300 that might just cost him his life if the Bartons caught up to him. The Montana night was cool and clear, a canopy of stars guiding his way as he put distance between himself and trouble. He wasn't sure where he was headed, only that he needed to get far enough away that the Bartons would give up the chase. By dawn, he'd crossed into a narrow valley he didn't recognize. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Buck, was tiring after the all-night ride. In the distance, nestled against the foothills, Zeke spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be a small homestead. "What do you say, Buck?" he murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Should we see if they're friendly folk who might spare some water?" The horse nickered in response, and Zeke guided him toward the homestead. As they drew closer, he could make out a modest cabin with a small barn and corral. A vegetable garden was visible on one side, and chickens scratched in the yard. It wasn't much, but to someone who'd spent his life on the move, it looked almost like a picture from a storybook. Zeke approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. Out here, strangers weren't always welcome, and he had no desire to ride into another hostile situation. He was about 20 yards from the cabin when the door swung open, and a woman stepped out onto the porch with a rifle leveled at his chest. "That's far enough, stranger," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "State your business." Zeke reined Buck to a halt and slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Name's Zeke Maddox, madam. Just passing through and looking for some water for my horse and myself, if you can spare it." The woman didn't lower her rifle, but she studied him with shrewd eyes. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with honey-brown hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her dress was simple but clean, and though she was slight of build, there was a determination in her stance that suggested she was more than capable of handling herself. "You running from something, Mr. Maddox?" she asked, nodding toward his dust-covered clothes and the dark circles under his eyes. "Just a misunderstanding, madam. Some fellows took exception to my luck at cards." He offered what he hoped was a disarming smile. "I'm not bringing trouble to your door, I promise. If you'd rather I move on, I understand." She seemed to consider this for a moment, then slowly lowered the rifle. "There's a pump by the corral. Water your horse, then come up to the porch. I've got coffee on." Relief washed through him. "Much obliged, madam. The name's Lillian," she said. Lillian Calloway. As Zeke led Buck to the pump, he couldn't help but wonder about the woman. She was alone as far as he could tell, which was unusual for these parts. Homesteading was hard enough work for a family. For a single woman, it was nearly impossible. After seeing to his horse, he approached the cabin. Lillian had set 2 tin cups of steaming coffee on the small porch table and was now seated in a wooden rocking chair, her rifle propped against the wall beside her close enough to grab if needed. "Thank you for the hospitality," Zeke said, removing his hat and taking the seat she indicated. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what he needed after the long night. "Where you headed?" she asked, getting straight to the point. Zeke shrugged. "Hadn't decided yet." "Away from Promise Creek, that's for certain. That's 20 miles north of here." She sipped her coffee. "The Barton brothers," he raised an eyebrow. "You know them?" "Every decent person in 3 counties knows to steer clear of them." She paused. "How big was the pot?" $300. Lillian let out a low whistle. "They'll come looking." "I know." Zeke looked out over the peaceful homestead, feeling a pang of regret for bringing even the mention of the Bartons to this place. "I'll be moving on soon as my horse is rested." Before Lillian could respond, a thin wail rose from inside the cabin. Her expression softened immediately, and she set down her coffee cup. "Excuse me," she said, rising from her chair. "Duty calls." She disappeared inside, and moments later the crying quieted. When Lillian returned to the porch, she was cradling a small bundle in her arms. Zeke shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he realized it was an infant, no more than a few months old. "This is Emma," Lillian said, a note of pride in her voice. "My daughter." The baby gurgled and blinked sleepily at Zeke with bright blue eyes that matched her mother's. "She's small," Zeke said awkwardly, not knowing what else to say. He'd had little interaction with children of any age in his drifting years, let alone babies. Lillian smiled. "She's growing fast. 5 months old next week." An uncomfortable question nagged at Zeke, but he knew better than to ask about the child's father. Out here, people had their stories, and not all of them were for sharing with strangers. As if reading his thoughts, Lillian said, "My husband, Daniel, died last winter. Pneumonia took him quick." Her voice was matter-of-fact, though Zeke could detect the undercurrent of grief. "We'd only been here 8 months. Emma was barely 2 weeks old." "I'm sorry for your loss," Zeke said, meaning it. He couldn't imagine the courage it must take to carry on alone in such circumstances. Lillian nodded her acknowledgement. "We were going to build something here, a real home, a future." She looked out at the land, her eyes distant. "I still am." The baby began to fuss again, tiny fists waving in the air. Lillian adjusted her position, bouncing gently. "Would you like to hold her while I fetch her blanket?" she asked suddenly. Panic flashed through Zeke. "Oh no, madam, I ain't good with babies." Lillian's blue eyes met his, a challenge in them. "Then learn with me," she said, already extending the bundle toward him. Before he could protest further, Zeke found himself with an armful of squirming infant. He held Emma stiffly, terrified he might break her somehow. "Support her head," Lillian instructed, adjusting his arms. "There, like that." The baby looked up at him with curious eyes, seemingly as uncertain about this arrangement as he was. Then, to his surprise, she grabbed his finger with her tiny hand and held on tight. Something shifted in Zeke's chest, a feeling he couldn't name, warm and uncomfortable all at once. Lillian returned with a soft blanket, which she tucked around Emma before taking her back. The relief Zeke felt at relinquishing the baby was tempered by a strange sense of loss. "You did fine," Lillian said with a small smile. "Not everything can be learned on horseback, Mr. Maddox." Before he could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Zeke was on his feet instantly, hand going to his gun. "Get inside," he said, all trace of uncertainty gone from his voice. Could be nothing, but could be the Bartons. Lillian didn't argue. She hurried into the cabin with Emma while Zeke moved to the corner of the porch that offered the best vantage point. He squinted at the approaching riders, 3 of them, moving at a steady pace rather than a gallop, not the Bartons then, or at least not in hot pursuit. Still, Zeke remained tense as the riders drew closer. He recognized the lead rider's bay horse before he could make out the man's face. Thomas. He called out, surprised. Thomas Rogers reined his horse to a stop in front of the cabin, relief evident on his face. "Zeke, glad I found you." He nodded at the other two men whom Zeke didn't recognize. "This here's Deputy Marshal Collins and his man Simmons." The marshal, a stern-faced man with a salt and pepper mustache, tipped his hat. "Mr. Maddox, I believe you may have something that belongs to Floyd Barton." Zeke's hand inched closer to his pistol. "One fair and square in a poker game, Marshal. No law against that." "No, there ain't," the marshal agreed. "Just as there's no law against me suggesting you might want to return those winnings to avoid further unpleasantness." "What's happened?" Zeke asked Thomas, ignoring the marshal's thinly veiled threat. Thomas looked grim. "Floyd sent his youngest brother, Calvin, and two others after you last night. They caught up with a rider about 10 miles south of Promise Creek, thought it was you in the dark. Shot him dead before they realized their mistake." Zeke's blood ran cold. "Who was it?" "Young Wilson boy, headed home to his family's ranch." "Jesus," Zeke breathed, running a hand through his hair. "An innocent man dead because of his poker winnings." "Are they after the Bartons for the murder?" The marshal's expression tightened. "Calvin Barton claims it was self-defense, that Wilson drew first. His companions backed his story. Of course they did. The Bartons had influence in these parts, the kind that came from fear and money spread in the right places. So instead of arresting murderers, you're out here trying to pressure me into giving back money I won honestly?" Zeke's voice was dangerously quiet. The cabin door opened and Lillian stepped onto the porch, Emma in her arms. "Gentlemen," she said coolly, "this is private property." The marshal's eyes narrowed as he took in the woman and child. "Mrs. Calloway, I presume? My condolences on your loss. Your husband was a good man." "Thank you," Lillian replied. "Now, what business brings a deputy marshal to my door? Just having a word with Mr. Maddox here." The marshal's gaze shifted back to Zeke. "The Bartons are offering a compromise. Return the money and they'll let the matter drop." Thomas snorted. "Until the next time they lose at cards and decide to shoot someone." The marshal shot him a warning look. Zeke glanced at Lillian, standing proud despite the tension in the air. At Emma, innocent and oblivious to the violence that men like the Bartons brought into the world. At his own hands, calloused from years of hard work but clean of another man's blood. "Here's my counter-offer," Zeke said finally. "I'll give 200 of the 300 to the Wilson family. The rest stays with me as compensation for nearly getting killed over a card game." The marshal considered this. "Floyd won't like it." "Floyd can take it up with me directly if he wants," Zeke replied coldly. "Or he can explain to a judge why his brother shot an innocent man." After a long moment, the marshal nodded. "I'll convey your offer." He turned his horse. "But Maddox, I'd watch my back if I were you. The Bartons have long memories." With that, he and Simmons rode off, leaving Thomas behind. "You sure about this, Zeke?" Thomas asked quietly. "Those $200 won't bring the Wilson boy back, and it won't make the Bartons forget." "I'm sure," Zeke said. "It's the right thing to do." Thomas nodded, respect in his eyes. "I'll stick around until tomorrow, camp by the creek if that's all right with you, madam," he said to Lillian. "Just in case the Bartons decide not to be reasonable." Lillian hesitated, then nodded. "There's a good spot under the cottonwoods. But no hunting on my land and no fires except for cooking." "Yes, madam," Thomas agreed, tipping his hat before riding toward the creek. When he was gone, Lillian turned to Zeke. "That was a generous offer you made," Zeke shrugged. "Seems like blood money now. I don't want it." "What will you do?" she asked. "After this is settled, move on, I suppose, find work with another outfit." It was what he always did, the only life he knew. Lillian studied him for a moment. "Or you could stay." Zeke blinked in surprise. "Stay, I need help around here," she said practically. "This place is too much for one person to manage, especially with Emma to care for. I can offer room and board, plus a small wage once we get the crops in." "Madam Lillian, we barely know each other," Zeke pointed out. and I've got the Bartons gunning for me." "The Bartons are 20 miles away, and they're not likely to waste time hunting a man who gave away most of his winnings," Lillian countered. "As for not knowing each other, well, that can change. I'm a good judge of character, Mr. Maddox. You didn't have to give away that money, but you did." "That tells me something about you." Zeke was speechless. No one had offered him a place to stay, a real place, not just a bunk in a ranch house, since he'd left home at 18. Emma cooed and reached out toward him, as if adding her own argument to her mother's. "I don't know the first thing about farming," Zeke admitted, "or babies." Lillian's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then learn with me," she repeated softly, and somehow in that moment it seemed like the most natural thing in the world to say yes. The first weeks at the Calloway homestead were a steep learning curve for Zeke. He rose before dawn each day to tend to the livestock, a milk cow, the chickens, and the 2 workhorses Daniel Calloway had purchased before his death. Then came the back-breaking work of preparing the fields for planting, repairing fences, and 100 other tasks that never seemed to end. But for the first time in his drifting life, the work felt purposeful. This wasn't just another job to earn enough money to move on. This was building something that would last. Lillian was a patient teacher, showing him how to test soil, when to plant each crop, and how to preserve food for the winter months ahead. She never made him feel foolish for what he didn't know, and she trusted him with increasingly important responsibilities as the days passed. Emma, too, was teaching him lessons: how to hold her without fear, how to recognize her different cries, how to make her laugh with silly faces that he'd never have imagined himself making before. One evening, about 3 weeks after his arrival, Zeke was sitting on the porch mending a bridle while Lillian rocked Emma nearby. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the newly planted fields. "You're good at that," Lillian remarked, nodding toward his handiwork. Zeke smiled. "Leather work's something I do know. Had a job with a saddle maker for a spell when I was 19. "Another skill to add to your growing list," she said. "You're a quick study, Zeke Maddox." The use of his first name sent a pleasant warmth through him. Over the weeks, they'd settled into a comfortable partnership, but there remained a careful distance between them, the respect due between a widow and a hired hand. "Learned from the best," he replied, tying off the last stitch. "Your late husband left some big boots to fill around here." Lillian's expression grew thoughtful. "Daniel was a dreamer. He saw this land and envisioned a thriving farm, a place our children could inherit someday." She stroked Emma's cheek gently, but the practical details sometimes escaped him. "He'd have admired your methodical approach." Zeke felt oddly pleased at the thought. "What was he like?" he asked, suddenly curious about the man whose place he had in some ways taken. "Kind," Lillian said immediately. "Optimistic to a fault. He taught school back east before the war. Came west afterward, said he couldn't stand being cooped up indoors after seeing so much of the country during his service." A small smile played on her lips. "We met in Denver. I was working as a seamstress for a dressmaker there. He courted me for 6 months before I agreed to marry him." "He was a persuasive man," Zeke observed. Lillian laughed. "Persistent is more like it. I wasn't sure about leaving the city for homestead life, but Daniel painted such a beautiful picture of our future here." Her smile faded slightly. "He did everything he could to make this place a home before." She trailed off. "Before he got sick," Zeke finished quietly. Lillian nodded, her eyes on Emma, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "It happened so quickly. One day he was fine, the next he had a cough, and within a week." She took a deep breath. "The nearest doctor is in Coopersville, 2 days' ride. By the time I realized how serious it was too late." Zeke's heart ached for her. "I'm sorry." "So was I," she said simply. "For a long time. But then I realized that sorrow wouldn't plant the crops or feed the animals or take care of Emma, so I did what needed doing." Zeke studied her in the fading light, this remarkable woman who had faced loss and hardship with such quiet strength. "You're something else, Lillian Calloway." She met his gaze, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Maddox?" "The highest one I know how to give," he assured her. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, the first stars appearing overhead. When Lillian finally rose to put Emma to bed, she paused at the door. "I'm glad you stayed, Zeke," she said softly, then disappeared inside before he could respond. That night, as he lay in his small room off the barn, Zeke realized with sudden clarity that he was no longer thinking about moving on. For the first time in 10 years, he had found a place where he wanted to put down roots. Spring gave way to summer, and the homestead flourished under their combined efforts. The vegetable garden yielded a bounty that Lillian preserved in jars lining the cabin's shelves. The wheat field, though modest in size, promised a good first harvest. They'd even added 2 more milk cows and a small flock of sheep, purchased with some of Zeke's remaining poker winnings. Emma was growing too, becoming more alert and interactive with each passing day. She had learned to sit up on her own and would babble excitedly whenever Zeke entered the room. To his surprise, he'd become quite adept at caring for her, changing diapers, preparing her food, and even getting her to sleep when she was fussy. "You're a natural," Lillian told him one afternoon as he gently bounced Emma on his knee while they shelled peas on the porch. Zeke laughed. "Hardly. But she's a good teacher." He made a face at Emma, who giggled and patted his cheek with her tiny hand. Lillian watched them with an expression that made Zeke's heart skip a beat. There was tenderness there and something else he wasn't quite ready to name. Their relationship had evolved over the months into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Zeke found himself looking forward to their evening conversations on the porch when the day's work was done and Emma was asleep. They'd talk about everything and nothing, their pasts, their hopes for the harvest, the news Thomas brought on his occasional visits. Thomas had become a regular visitor, riding out from Promise Creek every few weeks with supplies they couldn't produce themselves and updates on the outside world. The Bartons, he reported, had eventually accepted Zeke's compromise, though they'd made it clear he wasn't welcome back in Promise Creek. "Fine by me," Zeke had said. "Got everything I need right here." In early August, they decided to take Emma to Coopersville for supplies and to have her checked by the doctor. It was her first trip away from the homestead, and Lillian was both excited and nervous. "What if she gets sick on the journey?" she fretted as they loaded the wagon. "Or what if something happens here while we're gone?" "Thomas is coming to watch the place," Zeke reminded her, securing their bags. "And Emma's strong as a little ox, she'll be fine." Lillian smiled gratefully at his reassurance. "You're right, I'm being silly." "Not silly," Zeke said. "Just a good mother." The journey to Coopersville took most of the day, with several stops to tend to Emma's needs. By late afternoon, they were driving down the town's main street, drawing curious glances from the locals. "They're wondering who you are," Lillian explained, noticing Zeke's discomfort under the scrutiny. "Last time I was here, I was a new widow with a newborn. And now?" Zeke asked. Lillian considered this. "Now I'm a woman with a thriving homestead and a—" She paused, seemingly at a loss for how to define him. "Partner," Zeke suggested. She smiled. "Yes, a partner." They secured rooms at the small hotel, one for Lillian and Emma, another for Zeke, and arranged to see the doctor the following morning. After getting settled, they had dinner at the town's only restaurant, where Emma charmed everyone with her sunny disposition. As they walked back to the hotel in the gathering twilight, Emma drowsy in Lillian's arms, Zeke found himself wishing they were a real family, not just partners in a business arrangement, but husband, wife, and child. The thought caught him off guard. When had his feelings for Lillian transformed from respect and friendship into something deeper? He couldn't pinpoint the moment, but he knew with sudden certainty that he was falling in love with her. The realization left him both exhilarated and terrified. Lillian was still grieving her husband, still wearing his ring. She had invited Zeke into her life as a helper, not a suitor. To speak of his feelings might destroy the trust they'd built. So he said nothing as they reached the hotel, just bid her and Emma good night and retreated to his room to wrestle with emotions he'd never expected to face. The next morning, the doctor pronounced Emma perfectly healthy and growing well. "You're doing a fine job with her, Mrs. Calloway," he said, then nodded at Zeke. "Both of you." Lillian beamed with pride, and Zeke felt a surge of joy at being included in the compliment. They spent the rest of the day purchasing supplies, fabric for new clothes, seeds for fall planting, tools Zeke needed for various projects. At the general store, Lillian lingered over a beautiful blue ribbon. "You should get it," Zeke encouraged. "It matches your eyes." Lillian blushed slightly. "That's frivolous. We need practical things." "Sometimes a little frivolity is practical for the spirit," Zeke countered, adding the ribbon to their purchases before she could object. Later, as they loaded their wagon for the return journey, the store owner's wife approached with a small package. "A gift for the little one," she said, handing it to Lillian. "It's good to see you smiling again, dear. Your husband would be pleased." Lillian thanked her graciously, but Zeke noticed a shadow cross her face at the mention of Daniel. The reminder of her loss, and of how the townspeople perceived their relationship, dampened his earlier optimism. They were halfway back to the homestead when Emma began crying inconsolably. Nothing Lillian did seemed to soothe her. "Let me try," Zeke offered, pulling the wagon to a stop under a large cottonwood tree. He took Emma from Lillian's arms and walked her around the tree, speaking softly to her. To both their surprise, she calmed almost immediately, her sobs giving way to hiccups and then to quiet contentment. "She trusts you," Lillian said, watching them with wonder. "She feels safe with you." Zeke looked down at Emma, her tiny hand clutching his finger, her eyes so like her mother's gazing up at him with complete confidence. "I'd do anything to keep her safe," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you?" Something shifted in Lillian's expression. She approached slowly until she was standing directly before him. "I know you would," she said quietly. "You've proven that every day since you arrived." They stood there under the cottonwood, Emma between them, the summer breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Zeke felt as though they were balanced on the edge of a precipice, and the next words spoken would determine whether they fell or flew. "Lillian," he began, his heart pounding. "I know I came to your door as a stranger in trouble, and you gave me a chance when you had every reason not to. These past months have been—" He searched for the right words. "They've been the best of my life." Lillian's eyes widened slightly. "Mine too," she admitted. "After Daniel died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd just exist for Emma's sake. But then you arrived, and suddenly I was living again, not just surviving." Hope surged through Zeke. "What I'm trying to say not very well is that my feelings for you have grown into something more than friendship or partnership." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you, Lillian Calloway." For one terrible moment, she was silent, and Zeke feared he'd made a devastating mistake. Then a tear slipped down her cheek. "I've been so afraid to admit it," she whispered. "It felt like a betrayal of Daniel's memory, but I can't deny it anymore." She reached up to touch Zeke's face. "I'm falling in love with you too." Emma chose that moment to let out a happy gurgle as if giving her approval. Zeke laughed softly, his heart so full it might burst. "May I kiss you?" he asked. In answer, Lillian rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but perfect, a promise of things to come. When they parted, Lillian's cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were clear and certain. "We should take this slowly," she said. "For Emma's sake and for ours, there's no rush." Zeke nodded. "We have all the time in the world." They returned to the wagon hand in hand, Emma contentedly nestled in Zeke's arm. As they continued their journey home, Zeke found himself planning for a future he'd never imagined possible, a future with a woman he loved and a child who had claimed his heart as surely as if she were his own. The harvest season brought a flurry of activity to the homestead. From dawn until dusk, they worked side by side, bringing in the wheat, digging potatoes, gathering the last of the summer vegetables before frost could claim them. Their relationship blossomed alongside their crops. Each evening, after Emma was asleep, They would sit together on the porch or by the hearth, talking, planning, sometimes simply enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. "I'm thinking of adding an addition to the cabin come spring," Zeke said one night as they sat before the fire. "Another bedroom, maybe a proper dining room," Lillian looked up from her mending. "That's a big project. Worth it, though," he replied. "This place is too small for a growing family," her hands stilled. "Growing family," Zeke met her gaze steadily. "If you'll have me, Lillian. I know it hasn't been that long, but I'm certain of what I feel for you and for Emma. I want to be your husband, her father officially, not just in my heart." Lillian set aside her sewing and moved to kneel before him, taking his hands in hers. "You already are, in all the ways that matter," she said softly. "But yes, Zeke Maddox, I will marry you." Their wedding took place on a crisp October day, with Thomas serving as best man and the Reverend from Coopersville officiating. It was a simple ceremony, attended by the few neighbors who lived within riding distance and some of Thomas's friends from Promise Creek. Emma, now nearly 10 months old, sat on Thomas's lap during the ceremony, clapping her hands when Zeke kissed her mother. "You've done well for yourself, Cowboy," Thomas said later as they shared a celebratory drink. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd settle down." Zeke gazed across the yard at Lillian, who was accepting congratulations from the neighbors' wives. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But I can't imagine any other life now." Thomas raised his glass. "To the man who said he wasn't good with babies and the woman who taught him otherwise." Zeke laughed and clinked his glass against his friend's. "Best education I ever had." That night, after the guests had departed and Emma was asleep in her cradle, Zeke and Lillian stood on the porch of their cabin, his arms wrapped around her as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. Lillian turned in his embrace to face him. "More than I ever thought possible," she said, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "When you rode up that day, I had no idea you'd change everything." "You're the one who changed everything," Zeke corrected her. "You and Emma, you gave me a home, a purpose." He cupped her face in his hands. "A family. Our family," Lillian whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him. 5 years later, the Maddox homestead was barely recognizable from the struggling farm Zeke had first encountered. The cabin had been expanded as planned, with 2 additional bedrooms, a proper dining room, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. The fields produced abundant harvests, and their livestock had multiplied several times over. Emma, now a spirited 5-year-old with her mother's blue eyes and her adoptive father's adventurous spirit, was no longer the only child in the family. 3-year-old Daniel, named for the man whose dream had started it all, toddled after his big sister with determined steps. And in Lillian's arms, 2-month-old Sarah slept peacefully, unaware of the bustling world around her. Zeke stood in the doorway of their home, watching as Lillian sang softly to the baby while Emma and Daniel played with wooden blocks on the floor nearby. His heart swelled with a love so profound it sometimes left him breathless. "Papa," Emma called, spotting him. "Come see what we built." "I'm coming, little one," he replied, crossing the room to kneel beside his children. Emma leaned against him comfortably. "Thomas is coming today, right?" "He promised to bring me a book." "If the weather holds," Zeke confirmed. Thomas had become the children's honorary uncle, visiting regularly with gifts and stories of his adventures. "Will you tell us the story of how you and Mama met?" Daniel asked, his eyes so like Zeke's own wide with anticipation though he'd heard the tale many times before. Zeke exchanged a smile with Lillian. "Well, it all started when a rather foolish cowboy won a poker game he should have lost." As he recounted their beginning for his children, Zeke marveled at the journey that had brought him here from a drifting cowhand with no ties to a husband, father, and farmer with roots as deep as the old cottonwood by the creek. He had learned so much in these 5 years: how to plant and harvest, how to build and repair, how to comfort a crying child and support a tired wife. But most importantly, he had learned how to love completely and be loved in return. When the story was finished, Emma looked thoughtful. So if the bad men hadn't chased you, you never would have found us. I like to think I would have, Zeke said, ruffling her hair. Some people are meant to find each other, no matter what. Lillian came to join them on the floor, baby Sarah still cradled in one arm. She leaned against Zeke's shoulder, a position as familiar and necessary to him as breathing. "Remember what you said when I asked you to hold Emma that first day?" she asked softly. Zeke chuckled. "I believe my exact words were, 'I ain't good with babies.' And I said, 'Then learn with me,'" he finished, capturing her free hand and bringing it to his lips. "Best offer I ever accepted." Outside, the sun was setting over their land, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Inside, surrounded by the family he never knew he wanted, Zeke Maddox was exactly where he was meant to be.